Welcome folks who are joining for lunchtime Brassica webinar. We'll give it a few quick minutes to let people log in and get their Zoom all set up. Today we have over 100 people registered, so we're in a sort of webinar format. So you will have your camera turned off and you'll be muted. So if you have a question as we're going through, please put it in the chat box. When you open the chat, you'll see that you have the option to send messages to the hosts or to everyone. And if you're willing to share your question with everyone, I think it helps we don't get the same question multiple times. So, but you do need to select that in the chat, I think. You can also raise your hand and we can get to your question that way as well. Let's see. Genevieve's putting some information in the chat box now, which is links to some resources. We put all of these tips into a PDF document that you can access there, and some other scouting sheets and our web page. So those are, I think, all the logistics. We're recording the webinar. It's going to be posted online at the link that Genevieve will share. And we have 4 presentations, quick tips and tricks for our main insect pests of brassicas. And we're going to kind of go in order as we might see them through the season. So I just wanted to quickly say this project is a SARE funded grant project. We have 5 researchers working across the Northeast on some of these questions, and this is our final year. It's actually an extension of the project because of COVID-19. And so in this last year, we are hoping to be able to show some impacts of our work. And so at the end, we'll share with you ways to get involved with the project and help us collect some information about impacts of this work. So I'm going to stop rambling now and introduce Farouk Zaman. He's from Cornell Cooperative Extension on Long Island, and he's going to talk about cabbage root maggot. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sue, for the nice introduction. And okay, so today I'll talk about cabbage maggot, which is a very significant pest of many brassica crops. Although I'm presenting today, but it's a coordinated project work with my colleagues Dan Gilrain and Callie Jackson. So here, let's know the cabbage maggot fly a little bit. It resembles to housefly, but unlike housefly, this will not come into your kitchen. It will actually rather will go to your cabbage field. So here you see the female on the top picture is a little bit larger than the male, which is at the bottom picture, and female is a little bit grayish color, and then the male is a bit of blackish color. So here you see in this picture, the eggs on the stem of a cabbage plant, and also the on the near the soil near the stem. So the eggs are very small. It's half of the size of a rice grain. But if you look carefully for your scouting purpose, you can see those whitish things. It's very visible on the ground or on the stem. So and then the eggs hatch, and then the small larvae come out, or maggot come out, and then it starts feeding. So here I put several pictures, several kinds of damage, and I rated them based on damage severity from 0 to 10. 0 is no damage, 10 is extreme damage. So you can use those scale for your scouting purpose, or to understand like what level of damage means what? Do I need to spray anything, or do I really have damage? So here you see the first 1, 2, 3. These three, I would say, the sign of slight feeding. So as you see, number 1, very little shallow feeding. 2 is a little bit more. 3 is further little more. And here in this picture, from 4 to 7 scale, I would say tell them sign of moderate feedings. As you see, the number of feeding as well as the length of feeding and depth of the feeding increases. And then 8, 9, 10, I'll tell them the sign of a severe feeding. As you see, the roots are almost gone. Number 10, no roots are there, and a lot of cabbage maggot are on the roots. So they are actively feeding. So these are the severe damage. So here is the sign of an above ground damage. You may not look at your root, but you will see the plants are yellowing and then wilting sporadically, and also dead plants. So this situation is much visible if the field grade dry, because there is no root. Plants cannot take anything. So the previous 3 slides, I can say that the growers can use those as any scouting tools. Like, let's say you collected 20 cabbage plants and checked their root and then graded them. If you see less than 1 average feeding, like the severity, I would say like the cabbage plant can withstand those kinds of damage, at least if those plants are 2 to 4 weeks old or older than that. They can compensate very well with those kinds of low levels of feeding. So that's another, could be used as an scouting tools. Here there are some other prediction, like some of the natural predictor that growers can use. Some of the flowers, natural or wild flower, that they bloom at the same time of cabbage maggot fly emergence. As you see the list, the yellow rocket, the peak spring emergence pretty much coincides, or the yellow rocket rocket bloom time. Second peak emergence with the daylily, third peak emergence with the Canada thistle or the early goldenrod, and then the fourth peak, that's with the bloom corresponds with the bloom of New England aster. So if you don't want to see like they use some easy techniques for your scouting, you can use the yellow sticky card that will capture some of the flies, but also will capture some other insects. But you can identify them on the yellow sticky card easily, like how many of them are the cabbage maggot fly. So the other way you can predict cabbage maggot infestation by using the degree day model. If you go to the NEWA site and select your weather station, nearby weather station and date, then you will see the degree day accumulation at 40 degree day Fahrenheit from January 1st. As you see the black line, actually the degree day model, when it passes, it entered into the brown section, that's when the cabbage maggot fly start emerging. When it touched the red, the black line cross that red line, that is the peak emergence times. So the growers need to do some control when the black line actually cross the red line. So that's another way to predict the infestation. You can assume like or expect cabbage maggot damage if you have wild mustard plants around your field or the wild radish. You see that those are the pretty much pretty good wild host for cabbage maggot. And then if you see like, okay, so some of the scouting results tells that you need to spray. So we tested some of the, the large ban is the standard, but it will be banned after July this year. So then you have some alternative that we tested, but note that not all of those insecticide are permitted in all region, and there are some application method restriction. As we tested the Radiant, Entrust, Verimark, some of the row cover exclusion netting method, and we compared them with the large band. And so we used some of the insecticide as a pre-transplant treatment, as well as the direct application after 2 weeks. So here is the picture showing how we do the pre-transplant treatments 24 hours before the transplanting in the main field. So here you see the setup of our exclusion netting. This is not practical for large scale grower, I would acknowledge, and it is actually for small growers or some organic growers. So here is the results of our trials. I'll be going briefly. Here you see that we did it in 2018, 19, and 20. So we got pretty good population in our control field. And then Lordsburn consistently doing very good control. But here you see the exclusion netting. If you seal the sites very well, it can provide well above 95% control from cabbage maggot as well as from other insects like flea beetles and then the Lepidoptera, because they cannot pass through this net. Varimark, another insecticide labeled for cabbage maggot, that also giving very good control, as you see on the first 3 bar on your left side. That also gave very good control. Radiant and Entrust, they also give more moderate level of control if you use them as a trade rinse plus a directed spray. With all those treatments, you see the severity of treatments. Remember that I graded them from 0 to 10 scale. The severity was very low with all those effective treatments compared to the untreated control that was on the left side. I think that was my last slide. So here I would like to acknowledge some of the funding agencies like Near Farm Viability Institute, Northeast SARE, IR4, and some other industry and some other organization. So I think that was for me. So I think I am on time or a couple minutes.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Farouk.
If you have any question, feel free to ask.
Yeah, so folks, please put any questions in the chat. I know this is kind of like lightning talks because it's just a 1 hour lunchtime thing, but feel free to ask questions or raise your hand. We'll transition over to the next talk now, and answering questions. We'll save questions
Sure.
at the end.
Check that chat box if there are any questions.
Yep. So if you want to stop sharing, I'll share mine. And I see a few questions here. One, Farouk, you were using the PVC along the side of the netting too?
Yes, it's just because we have a lot of old PVC pipes. Those are not PVC, those are the aluminum pipes, but I'm using them. But in any way, growers can seal their side with some stone or the sandbags or anything. The bottom line is that you will have to close the side.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty smart. And I think keeping the soil off the netting can extend the life of the material.
Yes, that also give them opportunity to wrap them around so that it will not touch the soil that much. So a lot of growers have some old pipes or things, they can use them.
Okay. Have you had any luck with Azadiractin or Spinosa baits for cabbage maggot?
No, I never tried those.
Yeah.
So the bait treatment, I can explain.
Yeah, I don't know if it's labeled for that. The Spinosa bait, what is it called? Seduce. I don't know if it's labeled for root maggot, but the Entrust you can apply as a drench treatment. And
yes, that's what I tested, like as a pre-transplant trade rinse. And so that was not, the trade rinse alone was not giving that much of control, but the efficacy increased if when I used another application 2 weeks from the transplant. So that gave.
So a drench followed by
a
drench application in the field 2 weeks later. And we saw something similar when we looked at that in the field too. So last question here, maybe at what point in growth is it no longer necessary to apply insecticides?
I think after 4 weeks, it may not necessary, but if you have a severe infestation like the picture at the 9 or 10 level of damage, those were 6 weeks old plants, but those are the extreme damage. And then the field was dry and it was a sandy field. Like Long Island, so the water was going down very easily. So those kinds of situation, you'll have to be a little bit careful for older plants. But if you pass 4 weeks with a good condition in field, enough moisture, you may not get that much of impact from cabbage maggot.
Okay, I think that's a good point to move on to the next presentation, but keep asking questions because we'll have some time at the end. I'm up next. I'm gonna talk, if I can get my slides to advance here. Some tips for managing flea beetles. So I've sort of started with my take-home messages here. Flea beetles overwinter on your farm, so you do have sort of an opportunity there to the ways that you manage them could impact the size of the population over time, especially if you don't have a lot of neighbors growing brassicas. You really need to scout regularly and just keep on top of flea beetles. They, once they're here all summer long pretty much. So staying on top of it and protecting crops when they're susceptible and using the flea beetle preferences, host preferences to your advantage. So just briefly, the life cycle of flea beetles, they overwinter as adults in the field edges. In the spring, they emerge, and usually in early May, the adults emerge and they mate, lay their eggs at the base of the plant, and the larvae feed on roots in the soil. They don't usually cause a lot of damage, but they can cause a little damage. They will then emerge and from the soil again as adults. And you see here, there's two species of flea beetles that affect brassicas, the more common crucifer flea beetle and the striped, flea beetle. So this is a figure that I sort of put together based on when flea beetles are most active. So there's 3 generations a year. This is in May, they emerge kind of all at once when the weather warms up enough, and they're really concentrated at this time of year because there's not a lot of host material. They're emerging from their overwintering sites, and they're hungry and they're looking for a mate. So we see that first overwintering generation causing a lot of damage in the early season. And then there's 2 more generations. So you may see sort of peaks and valleys. We tend to see another peak in sort of late July and then there's another generation that seems to be cause less damage, but is still present until they leave the field in late September to go to those overwintering sites. So in my mind, you might see peaks and valleys, but they're kind of, once they're here for the whole summer. This is a drawing that Ruth Hazard made that I always love to show. So here's a sort of hedgerow around your field, maybe. This is, if your fall brassicas were here, this is where the flea beetles will probably want to hang out. So if you're thinking about crop rotation, like this is a really important tool with flea beetle because you have this opportunity to sort of break the cycle. And if you plant your spring brassicas in another field that's next to this field, for the flea beetles, they're the same field. So if you can, I know not everyone has the land to do this, but if you have a field that has some sort of physical barrier or is just far enough away. So the flea beetles are mobile, they fly, and they can sort of a minimum distance recommended is 200 meters to separate plantings of brassicas. But if it were an open, windy area, as far away as you can, and if you can put something like a roadway or woods or something between these blocks, that's all the better. In your breaks, in these, when you're rotating, it's important to make sure that you eradicate any alternative hosts. So there's a lot of brassica weeds. I just put up some tips for learning to recognize them. They tend to have this basal rosette, and then they send up a stalk that has 4 petaled flowers, and they usually have seed pods like these long skinny ones here, or this is shepherd's purse that has that sort of heart-shaped pod there. So using crop rotation, making sure when you've rotated away that you don't have any alternative hosts. And then once we get into the spring, we know, I know you guys know to use row cover if you can, and it has its limitations, but we know from lots of studies, like Fruit just showed, you can get nearly 100% control of root maggot and flea beetle and lots of caterpillars. So we know that it's really effective. So use row covers and netting wherever possible in the early season. If you don't have enough cover or the capacity to cover everything, focus on the most preferred or the most susceptible hosts, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Just some tips for using the row covers effectively. Like we talked about, here's that pipe. Seal the edges completely. I think that does make a difference, so they're not sneaking in. And make sure to control weeds. Some of the benefits of this exclusion netting or insect netting is you can use it during hotter parts of the year. Under the row cover, it can get too hot for the cool season brassicas. The materials are getting better and they're lasting longer, so that makes it a little more economical. We hear from growers that use the netting that because of the mesh you can see through and you know when you need to get in there and weed, but also the wind doesn't pick it up and drag it around and rip it, so you don't have to reset it as often, which can also save some labor. So thinking about the host preference and crop susceptibility here, the flea beetles have a preference for these Brassica rapa plants like Bok Choy, Komatsuna, Tatsoi, and this sort of moving to lesser preferred brassicas as we go down the list here. So brassica greens and radishes, also attractive, and the waxy brassicas, Brassica oleracea, like cabbages, kale, collards, are the least preferred. And that mostly has to do with the fact that these brassicas make this wax. So the flea beetles have a harder time sort of chewing through that, or they don't like it. So what you tend to see is the damage around the edge of the leaf, whereas these more, the other brassicas without waxes, you get the feeding all over the surface of the leaf. Also with the, so these are also susceptible for the entirety of their life, while these waxy brassicas are most susceptible when they're seedlings, and then as they mature, they develop that waxy coating and are even less susceptible then. So taking advantage of that and making sure to protect those plants during that susceptible window. You can use this to your advantage to do some trap cropping, where you have a cash crop and then you use a more preferred crop as a way to sort of concentrate the beetles there. There's all different ways to do this. Here's like a field that's completely surrounded. Here's one where there's just a strip of bok choy or a strip of mustard. I think whatever you can do to make this kind of fit with your system. You don't need to have a perfect square around the field. I've seen this used really effectively on larger scale organic brassica farms where every 8th bed was planted to a mustard strip. So you do need to spray that trap crop, otherwise you'll just have like a flea beetle farm. But you don't have to spray the entire field, you only have to spray that one strip. So it's a difference between having to set up a big sprayer or just use a backpack and hit a few rows, or just saving the time and the materials by not having to spray the whole block. You can also take it a step further and add a repellent to the main crop. And I've worked with some farms that have done this successfully by spraying surround on these main crops or cash crops. And it's just a white clay that the flea beetles don't like. It gets on their feet and their antennae and they don't like it. But then you really need to make sure you are spraying the trap crop regularly, especially if, so bok choy ends up being sort of a trap on our farms just because it gets hammered by flea beetles all season long. So you can just think of it that way and just spray the bok choy. But adding this protective element to the cash crop can help also. Just scouting regularly is really important, I think, and making sure that you are out there when the beetles arrive in early May. I think just assessing the damage and then thinking about the plants are damaged and there's still beetles here, or have they moved on to something else? So there aren't really thresholds for flea beetles because there's such a variability in the crops and whether they're leafy or heading crops, what the stage is, and also a wide range of market tolerance for damage. But I think if you have 10 or 25% damage and the beetles are there, it's time to do something. So for chemical controls, on organic farms, Entrust is really the only effective standalone product. It sticks on the leaf for 3 to 5 days and is consumed by the beetle and kills it. And so it provides some residual control. You can add Pyganic to get a little more knockdown effect, but Pyganic is not effective alone. With Entrust, you do need to be mindful of some limits on the label and can't spray more than twice in a row, I think. So check the label and be sure to follow that. But that's going to be your most effective option. There are many effective conventional insecticides, so just making sure to choose one of those. There are the diamides, neonicotinoids, and pyrethroids. Whenever you're spraying brassicas, unless you're spraying copper, then don't mix spreader sticker. But you always, with the waxy leaves, if you don't include a spreader sticker, the material can bead up and roll off the plant. So that's one way to increase your coverage. I recommend using hollow cone nozzles. They, like a lot of sprayers maybe come with a flat fan, which is good for some things, but just switching the nozzles can, it creates more of a like cloud of material that can get all around and underneath the plants. So I recommend that. Making sure you use enough water, and also just making sure that you're spraying enough. Like one spray is not going to be enough for a season of flea beetles, right? So keep up your scouting and protect the plants while they're susceptible, which is, again, for bok choy all season long, but for the waxy brassicas, just a few weeks while they're getting established, and then they'll be much better able to take care of themselves. So I just included this picture of a flea beetle covered in spores of Alternaria brassicilla, which a major disease. So if you were thinking about, if you were on the fence about spraying, this is another reason to control flea beetles. They can spread diseases. And that's what I have about flea beetles, just some practical tips there. So I'll stop there if there are any questions.
Sue, someone asked about for organic flea beetle control. Is there another effective insecticide to rotate Spinosa with?
That's a good question. Yeah. So not really. But so taking advantage of those 2 sprays that you have, or and check the label, maybe certain, but make sure that you're using those 2 sprays when they're going to be the most impactful. So on bok choy, using row covers or netting whenever you can to avoid having to spray, or the flea beetle holes on the bok choy, if they're the feeding damage on the holes expand as the plant expands. So a small hole on a seedling becomes a big hole as the plant grows. So focusing on that early period, if you only have 2 sprays, that's what I would recommend. And then, yeah, maybe spray some pyganic, and then you could go back to the entrust if you have a real problem. But hopefully, you know, targeting the crop when it's most susceptible, using the most effective material then. Dan, do you want to share your slides, and we could take one more question while that gets.
Sure. Okay. Very good. Okay, wonderful. All right, yes, and we're looking at your questions. Thanks, and keep sending those in, and we'll respond to all of them as we go along, and it's certainly at the end of the program. So thank you, Sue, and thank you, Farouk. And thanks all for being here. Markets were real hot here on Long Island. The farm stands are going absolutely bonkers. They can sell everything they're growing, and they're looking forward to doing the same again this year. And I assume that's probably going to be about the same in the areas where you are. You're going to have good outlets for what you're producing. So it's even more imperative to try to be able to produce a crop that you can market. And of course, you know who you're marketing to and what quality levels and what that means for all those different buyers. Well, one of the things that doesn't sell very well is something like this, and it sells even less well, or broccoli heads, when there are loopers that end up floating in the cooking water afterwards. So we can't have that. Aphids and other things don't go over well either. So caterpillars can be a big problem in particular, and we want to keep those surprises out of the produce as much as possible. We have 3 main caterpillars, of course, that are of concern. These aren't the only ones, but we'll talk about the others in a moment. But these are the 3 biggies that we deal with, and I'll talk about each in turn. One way to find out what you've got is, once you're familiar with them, is to do a little bit of scouting. This is always difficult if you're a busy grower, got a lot of other things going on, need to be in 3 places at one time at least. But we have a scouting program on Long Island, and that helps our growers considerably, so they can be off doing what they have to do. And the savings that they make in reduced insecticide use more than covers the cost for the scouting that they provide. So as growers, if this is something interesting to you, possibly a similar program could be set up in your area. Or if you can do this on your own, this is great. Just basically involves wandering through the crop, checking at a number of sites for different pests, and we have different levels of thresholds for certain ones that you can use to gauge when control might be necessary. These are the forms that we use on Long Island, and there are similar forms from UMass and for Brassica scouting. And you can design your own, just some kind of a record, so you keep track of things like what is there, as well as what is controlled after you make an application. You want to see that you're getting results when you do try to get control, that it's actually working. So you can make adjustments in these as necessary too. The one that we see earliest and most commonly, of course, is imported cabbage worm. This is the fuzzy caterpillar that is very familiar, often feeds on the upper side of the leaf as well as sometimes the underside. The butterflies have been out around here for a couple of weeks now. This is one of the few butterfly pests that we see as a problem in vegetables and any crop actually. Very few butterflies really are pests. They're mostly moths like this one. Cabbage Looper is the second one. This one tends to appear later in summer, usually here around mid-July or so is when we start to run into them. The moths are, you can see on the upper right there, there is kind of a figure 8 shape in silvery white there on the wing. That is one way to distinguish this from a lot of other very similar look-alike moths. The caterpillars can be striped or less striped, as you see here. They like not just brassicas, but also many other crops like tomatoes. They can be a real problem in too. And there's the flimsy cocoon that they produce, and the egg is that little white object. So when you're scouting, you're not just looking for the caterpillars, but you're also looking for the eggs kind of as an early warning that they're in the crop. If you touch them, they fall off pretty readily from those waxy leaves, but they have this white pearly look. Nothing else that I know of is likely to see that looks like that. Diamondbacks are probably the worst of the three that we deal with, and they tend to be more of a problem later in the season. But we had early season problems, and we've also had infestations of regrettably resistant diamondbacks that have brought in on transplants from other areas. So you don't often know what they've been exposed to. So, but we do know that diamondbacks are overwintering in our area and are probably overwintering or capable of it further north. And that's a reason sometimes to till under crop residues. So you're not dealing with overwintering populations that start out with them right away in the spring. And here you can see what the moth looks like, real small, about 1/4 of an inch long or so. And the caterpillar is on the left there. They have this forked kind of tail where their legs stick out and a very segmented kind of look. And the older ones will actually start feeding on the upper side of the leaves, but most of the time you'll see them on the underside. The eggs are really, really hard to see. They're very, very small. I have a picture of what they look like here. So on the lower right, you can see layers of eggs at the junction of 2 of the veins of the leaf there and the little flimsy cocoons that they make. So these are all, the eggs will be almost impossible to see, but the cocoons will be fairly easy, and they're distinctive enough that you can tell if you see them that that's a diamondback moth that's there. And there's a picture showing of some of the feeding damage from the underside of the leaf. And you'll notice in this is that they're chewing away the underside of the leaf and not chewing through it. So this is why when you're making an application, getting residue on the top of the leaf, whether it's BT, Entrust, or anything, is probably not going to provide the best kind of control for a pest that's starting out life feeding on the underside of the leaf. And later on, they'll chew through, but it's early on when they're going to be most susceptible that you want to try to get the best control. Another way to get some early warning of what's going on, besides just scouting, is to put out a pheromone trap. Now, we haven't really done this because we're relying on scouting, but for busy people that have other things going on, you might consider putting out a pheromone trap, and they are available for Cabbage Looper and Diamondback moth. These are the ones that you'd most want to know if and when they're in the area and get a sense of that, and the traps can help you do that. So there are some other worm pests we deal with too. These tend not to be common every year or severe every year, but we sometimes see salt marsh caterpillars, for example. This is something that'll feed on a lot of wild plants, and you'll get high numbers on 1 or 2 plants in a field, and it'll look awfully dramatic. But you generally see this as a widespread pest ever. Cross-striped cabbage worm can be sometimes annoying, and we've had occasional years with small-scale kind of outbreaks, and the damage can be pretty significant. But most years we tend not to see that. Beet armyworm is one that is a little more notorious. In some years, we'll see migratory populations come in. The reason it's a problem is because it can be resistant to a lot of things. Susceptible to BT, but resistant to a lot of other insecticides we try to use to control it. So that's particularly pyrethroids is the one that they're resistant to. There's already been some discussion about row cover and exclusion netting. This is a row cover, of course, the remay. This is a more inexpensive form of covering plants. It retains the heat a little more, so great for maybe spring. But it's been a problem in our area because deer are so common and will punch holes through it, making it almost useless. And we only get usually about a year of performance out of it anyway. The exclusion netting is much more durable and can last several years and allows for better ventilation. So that might be something to figure in when you're calculating would this be a possible solution or not? Of course, weed management beneath is an issue. That's why Farouk was looking at plastic mulch as a possible option, growing brassicas on. So maybe that would be a way to deal with the weed issue as well. You've heard a couple of people talk about the role of weeds in generating some of these pest populations and why it's good to get rid of them. And Sue has also talked about maybe even keeping some of them or growing some alternative hosts for flea beetles. Well, this is another interesting possibility, is using yellow rocket as a trap crop. Some work found that it's inordinately attractive to diamondback, and it's kind of a fatal attraction because they don't tend to survive feeding on it. They don't generally are able to breed after they're feeding on this yellow rocket. So this may be not only a good indicator plant for the first generation of cabbage maggot, but may also be a helpful one in dealing with troublesome diamondback moth populations if you seem to be dealing with those year after year. It's just a concept, just as an idea. Anyway, some overall suggestions for managing these caterpillars is to use clean transplants. I've mentioned the problem we've had with transplants brought in from other areas. So if you can grow your own, it's probably a little more economical, but it's also unlikely to deliver some resistant diamondbacks to your fields. Till under old residue. I saw a question about kale overwintering. That could possibly also be an overwintering site for diamondbacks, as well as for what is going to come next, and aphids that's going to be talked about. Netting a row cover, questions about that, economic practicality. There was in our original discussion on caterpillars a couple years ago when we presented these seminars, we talked about farmscaping, and Anna Legrand has been working on biological controls and trying to enhance them through other flowering plants. And we mentioned yellow rocket. Certainly when managing and needing to use an insecticide, I really recommend starting with BT. The issue there is frequency is more important than the rate, so be sure you're applying maybe weekly if you need to, or at least according to scouting guidelines. The problem, of course, with starting with BT is that BT is not effective against aphids or flea beetles or some other pests, so those need to figure into the choice of products. And you can rotate with other ones. Pyrethroids could be used, but I suggest later in the season because they are so antagonistic to the biocontrols that are helping you control some of these caterpillar pests. But they are highly effective against flea beetles too. So just sort of figure all that in, try to make the best decision. Coverage has been an issue, certainly because you want to get good coverage under leaves. That's where those little caterpillars are feeding first, and they're going to be the most susceptible when they're smallest. So raising pressure, increasing the gallonage, directing the material more to the plants, avoiding any that go onto the soil, adjust the nozzles if you have to, maybe including an adjuvant to improve spreading. These are all maybe some strategies that can help improve performance of things, especially something like BT that has to be consumed in order to be effective, and it does not work on contact. Timing, according to crop stage, pheromone traps, or scouting, just their scouting reports, and using thresholds. Maybe you might even reduce the threshold for diamondback moth if you're dealing with a consistent problem with that. But don't necessarily assume that resistance to insecticides is always operating here. Most of the time it's not, but diamondback is certainly the one that is most prone to this and the one to be watchful for. You have a lot of options in terms of what to do when you do need to treat, and the ones for organic production are in green. The ones in blue are EPA reduced risk options, some of which are not available for us on Long Island, but you can use in other areas. And then we have other conventional materials that are listed there in black as well. So you can make choices based upon some of these. And as I say, maybe start out with the BT. It's not only a least expensive kind of an option, but it is pretty effective for all the caterpillars we're dealing with. And then entrust, if you're an organic grower, could be saved for when you're dealing with flea beetles and you see something that's a little more highly effective, because it also works on contact and not just through ingestion. And so the other options, if you're conventional, you have choices here as well. And I think with that, I will end. And I don't know if we have a chance for questions here, but I will turn that over. And
if anyone has a question, just pop it in the chat there, or you could raise your hand and we'll get the next talk set up, which will be Becky Simon talking about the cabbage aphids.
I wanted to mention to you, somebody asked about the bait for the Spinosa bait. Spinosa bait seduce is used for fruit flies, not for flies like cabbage maggot and house flies. So this is at least not available for us now, and it's probably unlikely to be effective unless we change the formulation to include something that's attractive to cabbage maggot flies.
Good point. Okay, well, there's no questions at the moment. So Becky, if you want to go ahead and share your cabbage aphid tips. Great.
Yes, for sure. You're seeing my screen, I hope.
Yeah, it looks
Okay.
great.
Okay, great. I would like to thank you for that introduction and for putting this together, and also to acknowledge Alina Harris and Anna Wallingford's work in helping put all of these tips together and sharing some good photos, etc. So I'm going to go do a quick overview. It's likely that if you've had cabbage aphid, you know what cabbage aphid looks like, because when they're there, they are usually very abundant. But I would just like to point out there are occasionally other aphid pests on Brassica, such as green peach aphid and turnip aphid and some others. But what really differentiates cabbage aphid and makes them both particularly problematic and very characteristic is this very waxy coating that makes them look white or matte gray. Sometimes growers call them gray aphids for obvious reasons here. I should just mention here that green peach aphids sometimes are bright green, but sometimes they're red, and the coloring of aphids in general is not a good indication of what they are. The coloring varies with what they've fed upon and a whole bunch of other things. And so really it's important to have them be identified and not by me, by somebody who is better at identifying aphids than I am, by an entomologist that can do this really, really quickly and efficiently. But cabbage aphids are crystal clear usually because of that gray color. They are problematic on Brassica because they love new growth. And in particular, they're problematic on crops where we also feed on that new growth, like Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, broccoli. They're really problematic on these late season crops. And you can see that when they get into Brussels sprouts, it can be really difficult to even trim away that damage. It really renders them completely unmarketable. So we often see them attracted to that growing point. They can even cause that to be essentially blinded if they are in high populations. They can really, really stunt those plants. So very briefly, the life cycle here is that the cabbage aphids in the fall lay their eggs on both wild species, which you've heard a lot about in the other presentations, and cultivated brassicas. Those eggs hatch in the spring, and wingless females feed on the host. And then from then on, they're reproducing completely asexually. And whenever they get overly crowded, winged females are produced that then distribute more broadly across the environment. So it's really hard to predict where they're going to go once that crowding happens. So when we have things like overwintered brassicas, such as these sort of sad looking winter sprouting broccolis in a high tunnel here at our research farm, these are a perfect place where we kind of get outside that normal life cycle, and we can actually see adults surviving, and really they can be a source of cabbage aphids going into the spring season if we're not careful, if there have been a lot in the fall and through the winter. So focusing really specifically on cultural practices, rotating, you've heard over and over again, rotating fall and spring crops does help because it's in those previous crops and in crop residues and wild weeds where those cabbage aphids are going to originate in the spring. And so the further you can get from previous cabbage aphid problems, the better you are. We're going to come back to insectary plantings in a moment here. You've heard a lot about scouting. Scouting is absolutely critical for cabbage aphid management. You've got to scout regularly for signs because they can get going very, very quickly and really spread rapidly throughout the population. And so scouting regularly means at least weekly for cabbage aphid, scouting for the signs of the very first ones. And if you usually they appear in a very spotty pattern, roguing those heavily infested plants is a very useful practice. And the thresholds are very low. If 10% of the plants have more than one aphid, and it's rare to find just one aphid on a plant, then that means it's time to treat. So often that's very early, that can be quite early in the season. The reason I have this picture here is that this very vague yellowing that you can see on this leaf is the sign you are looking for. On the underside of those yellowing spots is where you will find those early cabbage aphids. And so these pictures right here, even though it may be just one plant in a much larger planting, this yellowing that you can see from a distance, when you get closer, is likely to be it will be the sign of where the cabbage aphids are hanging out. So this is what to look for early in the season. I mentioned treating when we hit that threshold. There are a number of conventional insecticide options that operate either by contact or they enter into the plant and they are systemic within the plant, partially or a little more extensively. The ones that I've highlighted in green are organic options. So there's a number of possibilities here. For these organic options, Azadiractin, oils, insecticidal soaps, and pyrethrum are all possibilities, each with their own challenges. For example, Azadiractin can be quite effective, but it's really going to be most effective on immatures because it's an insect growth regulator largely. We can get good physical control from oils and insecticidal soaps. But in order to get good physical control, you need to get good contact. And with pyrethrum, that can also be effective, but because of its photosensitivity, you've got to apply it in the evening to minimize that breakdown. So there are definitely some challenges with all of these. If you are going to use chemicals for cabbage aphid control, there are some best practices that are common, and they're ones you've already heard of in the other presentations. You've got to monitor and act early, and you're going to have to use repeat applications because they're going to keep coming back. You can't just, it's not a one and done situation. And because the aphids hide in those crevices underneath the leaves, and because brassicas are waxy, spreader stickers are critical. It may help to remove lower leaves on things like Brussels sprouts to increase penetration. It may be helpful. You may have to look at your nozzles. As Sue mentioned, you may want to go with hollow cone. You may want to use drop nozzles to try to increase penetration, but you're going to have to really pay attention to getting excellent coverage. So when I say a spreader sticker, what I mean is a product, an adjuvant that is specifically marketed to be added to a pesticide to encourage, and it basically reduces the surface tension so it doesn't just bead up like water does, and it actually sticks and covers the entire leaves. So an example would be new film. Maybe the other panelists could suggest some other ones. Insecticidal soaps, I think, can kind of act that way to a degree. So that is what a spreader sticker is. Basically, it breaks that surface tension so it gets improved coverage. So like with the caterpillars, conserving natural enemies can be very helpful in helping keep aphid populations under control. In a typical planting that's not heavily sprayed, it's very common to see hoverfly larvae, Aphidides larvae, predating upon cabbage aphid, and also D. rapae, this little parasitoid. It's very common to see these mummified aphids, and having insectary plantings, and alyssum is a great example, can help support these beneficial predators and parasitoids. That said, predators and parasitoids are unlikely to actually control cabbage aphid populations. They'll help, but they are not going to solve the problem. I'm not going to bore you with the research details unless you want me to, but I'll just tell you, it will not solve the problem. It will help, but it won't bring them completely under control. To kind of wrap this up, got to identify your aphid and make sure it is in fact cabbage aphid you're dealing with. Scout early, act often, and repeat, especially when using organic materials that are not persistent or systemic. One application will not result in control. We have gotten good control in our research trials with anywhere from 6 to 8 applications. What this basically means is that we are weekly scouting and seeing if we're above threshold and applying, and that's how much it takes to keep these actually at low levels, because they reproduce very, very quickly. Use adjuvants, e.g. spreader stickers when spraying insecticides to get really good coverage. Insectary plantings, I have a question mark because I think they are certainly helpful, but I would not suggest relying upon insectary plantings as a control strategy. There's no doubt that biocontrol actually contributes to controlling cabbage aphid, both in terms of the predators, like we were talking about, both generalists and specialists, but also entomopathogenic fungi in moist, humid years. These tend to be a very bad problem in drought years. I guess taking this into trying to summarize how I would view that in terms of a tip, I would say that minimizing the amount of chemical disruption is probably helpful, but that's probably as far as that goes at this point. And that is the end of my cabbage aphid tips. I don't know if we've got questions or if we want to go to like general questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Becky, and thanks all the speakers. Yeah, we do have some questions for you and questions just more generally. You covered a lot that came in the last moment, but one for you, Becky. How late in the fall should we continue to worry about aphids? Can you stop worrying about them at a certain point?
Well, I guess there's a couple of ways to think about that. It's true that if they haven't come in, probably by very late in the fall, like if they haven't come in, I'm just guessing here because I haven't actually seen this transpire in any of our research years. If for some reason they weren't there at all by mid-September, probably you're in good shape because the temperatures are cooling down, they're not going to come in anew, and the populations won't get out of control. So if you haven't for some reason seen them by then, you're probably good. If you have them, they will continue to be there and they will continue to persist late into the fall. We have seen situations in our research trials where storm events have come through and it's been very, very rainy for multiple days. And this has caused the populations to completely collapse to nothing. You can't count on this. So I've seen it happen, but you can't count on that happening. And so I think you need to be kind of vigilant straight on through. And the pictures I showed of them in a high tunnel, that was in March. They were completely happy as long as they were a little bit protected. So it's not like the cold temperatures really completely knock them back. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, cabbage aphid can survive and grow at maybe colder temperatures than we think of other aphids as being successful when it's really hot. But I want to just quickly launch this quick question for you all. We're going to keep answering questions as long as people have them, but two sort of points. We are at the end of this grant project, and we'd love to help out if folks on the call are interested in trying a new practice, something you learned about here today or in one of our previous webinars. So if you want to try something this year and are willing to check in with us about how it went, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm just going to leave that open, and we will do the pesticide poll in just a minute, but we'll keep doing a few more questions here. One, we've talked in a lot of these presentations about tilling in residues to get rid of potential overwintering insect pests. How can you do that, and how important is it? Maybe Becky, if you have any thoughts about
about how to do it, or
yeah, or like, should you remove them and compost them, or can you just mow them or disc them?
That's a really good question. I mean, my personal, I don't have research experience looking at different alternatives here, but my feeling as regards cabbage aphid in particular is that the best approach would be to, if you could early enough, actually disc it, incorporate it, and get a cover crop on there. And because it's really going to be breaking down if it's, you know, really truly like buried and incorporated. I would think that if you had really infested materials and you brought those to a compost pile that was not a managed compost pile, you would be essentially creating a very nice brassica-y residue pile full of cabbage aphid source for next year. And I think that would probably also apply for the other pests we've talked about. If it's an actively managed compost pile, then that's a different story. But if it's just a compost pile, I think you'd treat it essentially like a residue. It would be like a residue-y field that's not really incorporated. What do the rest of you guys think?
Yeah, I always tell people whatever you can do to speed the breakdown process up is good. Like, Brussels sprouts are hard because they're harvested so late. If all you can do is mow them and then they're lying on the surface over the winter, that's better than doing nothing. And it'll help with all of these insect pests and also the diseases that we see.
Growers here on Long Island disc in overwintered residue if they don't get a cover crop on in the fall, which is actually more desirable if possible. There's sometimes a little bit of a delay needed between incorporation through chiseling and when you can plant again, just because of brave brassica residues give off this the chemicals, but that seems to work pretty well. I should say, at least for diamondback, the adults can fly pretty early too. We've actually caught them in April on warmish days. So incorporating in as early as you can is a good idea. Not everybody can do that. But if you're dealing with particularly cabbage aphid problems, that's a priority, getting that residue incorporated as early as possible or the fall prior. If you can possibly do that and get a cover crop on, that's probably the best thing.
I'm going to launch this pesticide poll for those of you that need credits for this 1-hour workshop. Just answer this poll and we'll send your credit form by email. A lot of folks end up with them in their spam box, so if you don't see it right away, check your spam box. So, and we'll keep doing some more questions. Kind of a follow-up to that. What about brassica cover crops? Would you recommend avoiding brassica cover crops, or? Yes.
Yes.
Everyone's kind of nodding their head.
Totally, yes.
Yeah, there's so many brassica crops grown on all of our New England Northeast farms, and adding more brassicas is hard to recommend from a pest management standpoint. So if you had another compelling reason to include those, then
And one of them is forage radish. And I have some real questions about whether that does or doesn't contribute to any of these problems that we've had. It seems like it should. But there's some people very interested in using it. There's some good qualities to it for reducing lesion nematodes, and those have been a problem for us a little bit, affecting yield.
yeah.
But I think it's still an open question. I'd like to challenge Becky on that a little bit, and others. And
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think it's settled. And I actually would think that without having done real experiments to look at this observationally, I don't think tillage radish is amongst the most susceptible to cabbage aphid.
Yeah.
Like, I've seen it growing in places where there's a lot of cabbage aphid on other things, and they don't seem to be really on it.
Yeah.
But that said, I feel like if brassicas are a super important crop for you, I can't imagine that slapping a brassica cover crop would be high. Like, there's many reasons to not. I would maybe look towards other things, just because
and there's root disease issues to
Totally.
consider as well, So I think I'd like to see more experience with it, but there's some things that weigh against it. But we'd like to know more information on to say definitively.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Just like if you're planning to use brassica cover crops, just being really aware that those might be a source for some of these pests. So there were a few questions maybe about beneficial nematodes. I think Farouk about the root maggot, but I also get the question about flea beetles too. So do you have a comment about that, Farouk?
Yes, I actually answered those. For entomopathogenic nematode, I tried for cabbage root maggot control. It did not work that well. Some of the literature suggests like using over 100,000 per plants, but if you consider the cost, that's a lot. I tried 3,000 to 4,000 per plants. It did not work. But I don't think it is practical to suggest more than 100,000 per plants for cabbage maggot control in cabbage. So I never tried with that high rate, but with 3,000 to 4,000, I tried. It was not good. And so I think the question was also like some other organic product, except Entrust. I tried 2 other organic products, but the results was not that great. Like, it was pretty much the same as untreated control. Only Entrust, I got some good results.
Okay. At UMass, we did also look at the beneficial nematodes for flea beetle control, and we're not able to see an effect in the field, a strong effect in the field, a significant effect in the field. And in theory, they should be able to kill the flea beetle larvae, but it's so likely that new adult beetles would come in from other fields or weedy reservoirs that it's unlikely to be a very successful strategy unless you're thinking about it very long term and your farm is isolated from other brassica farms and you've really gotten rid of all the brassica weeds around.
And I caution people from interpreting too much from trials that are done in the greenhouse with potted brassicas with nematodes to extrapolating those to outdoors, because it's such a different environment. We see some cases where the results in a greenhouse in a small trial don't reflect what you'd get outdoors either. So be careful in interpreting that information.
Yeah, that's correct.
Any other questions? from folks? I have just one, maybe Anna, you could answer. Becky talked about the insectary, or Becky talked about the insectary plantings to attract predators and parasitoids. And if that's something people wanted to try, what are some of the species of flowers or planting strategies that you might recommend?
For some of the trials we did for the insectary plants, we see a good benefit from alyssum, which is a typical plant that has shown to be very good in terms of attracting a number of natural enemies, particularly the hoverflies. I think your studies in Massachusetts and our studies here in Connecticut have shown good levels of attraction for hoverflies. I think second dill and cilantro had a good showing in terms of attraction of hoverflies, and also we see some of the parasitoids too, in general, different groups of parasitoids coming to those plants. So those have shown good benefits as well. And we've been looking at Amimahus, which is another type of insectary plant that we are researching, and that one has shown also some degree of attraction to hoverflies, not as good as alyssum and not as good as dill and cilantro, but you know, AMI has shown some attraction. We also see benefits of AMI in terms of attracting parasitoids of the caterpillars that Dan spoke about today, particularly parasitoids that are attacking the imported cabbage worm and parasitoids that attack the diamondback moth. So we're looking at that further in terms of you know, trying to replicate what we have seen in some recent studies. But in general, AMI seems to be attracting those parasitoids. And for 1 year, we did see significant impact in terms of the levels of the diamondback moth, but we still need to replicate that more before, you know, having more conclusions. And also for 1 year, we saw significant differences in terms of the proportion of these parasitoids, meaning that when you had cabbage planted with AMI, we did see a change in the composition of the parasitoids, where more of the Cotysia rubecula, for example, a key parasitoid of imported cabbage worm, showed up more in the areas where AMI was planted. But again, this is just 1 year, so we have to take this with caution in terms of we need to look at further years, and that's what we're currently doing right now.
Great, thank you. Any last questions here before we sign off? Or any last comments from any of the presenters? What type of cilantro? I don't think it matters. Cilantro
I
that
think,
is flowering.
yeah, we unfortunately, that's a good question, because that will be nice eventually to look at the different varieties. But you know, we tested different types, so I think anyone that's you know, not spray at least for sure. That's an important part too.
And yeah, I just put in the chat the spelling of the Amimahus. Great, so we
yeah, Amimahus is it's a cut flower. It looks very much like the wild carrot, but it's, you know, it's a whole different species.
mm-hmm.
It's sold as a cut flower. The seed, you can use it for that.
Yeah, which is kind of a nice benefit also. Okay, well, with that, we'll let y'all get back to your day. And thanks for joining us. Thanks to those of you who signed up to help us collect some data about how these things work in the field, and wish you good luck controlling all of your brassica pests this year.
Have a great year.